So we're going to talk about the options that you have to renew your EMT paramedic certification with the National Registry, so you can get your renewed New Hampshire EMS or EMT paramedic license when it's time to do so. And you know that in the past that we've had two different ways to do that. Number one was the traditional refresher training program, so the RTP, which was a 48-hour program. And then to that we added 24 hours of other continuing education. So other Con Ed, which was 24 hours. There could be any, basically any kind of EMS issue, fire, rescue type issue. So anyway, 72 hours during your refresher period, refresher cycle. You could also do the exam in lieu. So if you wanted to take the cognitive exam and you passed it successfully, you could recertify and basically have 0 hours of continuing education. Within the past year, we've implemented a third option, which is consistent with what the National Registry requires, and that's to be able to do recertification through all continuing education. So continuing education for the entire 72 hours, Con Ed for the entire 72 hours. All right, will get you qualified to recertify by the National Registry. Now, National Registry breaks this down into two different categories. Okay, so we've got the refresher component. So the refresher, REF, refresher component, which is 48 hours. And then we've got the other continuing education hours, or Con Ed, which is 24 hours. Okay, so that's where we come up with the same 72 hours. And you'll notice, obviously, the refresher component is very reflective of the refresher training program. It's just that you can get it through continuing education hours as opposed to attending a state-approved, fairly rigid refresher program. So it provides maybe a little bit of flexibility. It's also probably a little more work on your part. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, the National Registry of EMTs, the NREMT, requires certain requirements, if that makes sense, but has certain requirements for these particular hours. I encourage you to go onto their website, which is nremt.org. Go onto the main page. It says recertification. Just click on that and look at some of the brochures for the EMT paramedic. It will break down how those hours occur. I'm going to go over those briefly, but again, I encourage you to go to this particular website to take a look at that. So let me just take a minute to clear off the page here. Okay, so I've set up the categories that the National Registry requires. Now there's two different, I don't know what else to call them, but I'll call them categories for the National Registry. So there's what they call the mandatory component, and then they have the flexible core. So the flexible core component. All right, so how does it break down? All right, so airway, breathing, and cardiology. Under the mandatory component, they are looking for 8 hours. Okay, for medical emergencies, they're looking for 3 hours. And under each of these, there's certain topics that you have to hit, and you need to go back to the nremt.org to figure out what particular ones that you have to hit. All right, trauma, the mandatory, they're looking for 5 hours. OBPD, they're looking for 8 hours, and there's nothing operational under mandatory. So that's 24 hours there. Right, now under the flexible core content, so again, airway, breathing, and cardiology, they're looking at 8 hours. The medical emergencies are looking for 5 hours worth of Con Ed related to basically any type of medical emergency. For trauma, just looking for 1 hour under that. For OB, PD, infant, all that kind of content, they're looking for another 8 hours. And then operational, which is kind of prep stuff, incident command, infection control, things like that, 2 hours. All right, so 24 hours total. So obviously you combine these, and that's the 48-hour of refresher component. All right, so we add that 48 hours. So we add the 24 hours of other continuing education, and then we have our 72 hours. Okay. All right. Now, there's a couple things that I need to warn you about, and let me just clear this for a second, and I'll set that up. So there's a couple of cautions that I would like to at least make you aware of. Number one is that you know, you're going to have to upgrade within the next couple of years. You can do it now, you could do it, you know, in the future, you know, next couple of refresher cycles. You're going to upgrade from the current EMTP level to the national level, which will be known as paramedic. All right, and there's you know, there's content that you're going to need to be aware of that is going to be only available through a formal state-approved refresher training program, 48 hours, which includes the transitional materials. And transition materials, don't confuse those with the old transitions, which we now call scope of practice for New Hampshire. These are transitions on the national level, but you'll need to take a particular RTP that has this content. This is not available through continuing education. Okay, so Con Ed, to be able to get to this upgraded level, is out. You can't do it that way. You're going to have to take a refresher sometime in the next 2 cycles that will bring you up to this level. That's caution number one. You know, caution number two is basically validation. All right, how do we validate the content of the continuing education that you take? You know, in the past we've had the ability to kind of regulate instructor coordinators when they submit the information to make sure that the content that they're giving is valid. This, you know, in continuing education we don't necessarily have that capability. So how are we going to deal with that? So validation, as far as the New Hampshire Bureau of EMS, is going to consist of random audits. Okay, so anyone who submits continuing education, all continuing education as opposed to a formal refresher, will be subject to random audits. Okay, so what are we going to be looking for? Well, you know, we're going to be looking for a certain level of documentation, and you know, that goes from fairly simple to fairly complex, depending on kind of where you get the education. So documents or documentation. So it may be just as easy as a list. Give us a list of the Con Ed that you used to submit to the National Registry, whether it's paper, whether it's electronic. It may be certs. We may be looking for certifications, you know, certs that you attended a particular class, again, whether it's paper or whether it's certs. And a lot of this stuff is available through, you know, through your medical resource hospitals. So hospitals, you know, conferences. If you go to conferences, you know, we're going to look very favorably on that kind of stuff. Folks who, you know, information or education you get from a licensed EMS instructor coordinator, you know, it won't have a lot of scrutiny involved. However, if you do have continuing education that you're using for your refresher training program through other sources like your own service, or you know, stuff that we're not really that familiar with, we may require a higher level of validation, you know, for that. And that validation may be, well, really the only way you'll be able to get it really is to go back to your instructor. Okay, so your instructor is going to be the one who's going to be able to supply the information that you need to submit to us, the instructor. All right, and let me clear this, and I'll show you what it is that we're looking for along those lines. Okay, so the things that we're going to be looking at from your instructor, I've written up here. So things that we're going to be looking at, you know, are there objectives that are written down for this particular educational presentation? What are the credentials of the individual who is giving that? You know, are they qualified to speak on the topic that they're discussing? When and where did the education occur? And a roster of people who attended the course. Now, All this information is the kind of stuff that the instructor is going to be the one who's going to be pulling together this information and keeping these records, whether they're paper or electronic. It's the instructor who's going to be responsible for this. And this is the kind of stuff that people who are doing conferences or working in the hospitals, they do all the time, and we're just going to have to get this information out to all folks. Is this the kind of stuff that you personally are going to be responsible for? Yes and no. You're going to be responsible for getting this information from the instructor if we ask you for it. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, one of the things, you are personally responsible for all of this stuff that you're going to use for refresher component. So it's basically a buyer beware situation. All right, very much a buyer beware. You being the buyer. Okay, buyer beware. Again, this is ultimately your responsibility. Even though you're going to be getting this from the instructor, it's your responsibility. So what does this mean? This means pick your instructor carefully. For stuff that you're going to be using to refresh, make sure that your instructor keeps these records and that gives you access to them. If the instructor says, no, I'm not going to be doing that, or you won't be able to get a hold of me, or if they just sound a little shaky, you should probably either pass on taking this education or use it for the 24 hours of other continuing education. But if you find yourself to where you can't get this information and we ask for it, you might find yourself having a suspended license until we can clarify this. So again, buyer beware. You need to be careful about where you get the education that you're going to be doing if you're going to be going with continuing education to get your refresher. All right. So that's the message there. That's the second caution. I don't want to take up any more of your time. I hope this was helpful. I hope this did clarify this a little bit. If not, please give us a call at the New Hampshire Bureau of EMS, and thanks for your time.